You're going to, well, that was the first thing I was going to say, and it's said for me. So welcome, everyone. We will be recording this session. So glad you could join us today. My name is Nora Silver. I'm the founder and faculty director of the Center for Social Sector Leadership that's sponsoring this talk. In fact, this is our kickoff of a speaker series for this academic year for students and other friends of the center and of Haas. And the theme this year for us is path-bending careers. Let me just take a moment and tell you how we got here. Over the years, I've heard so many students and others curious about how a career goes over time, not just your first job after an MBA or whatever degree you've earned, but how do you think about a route to a career? And at the same time, I hear from professionals out in the working world with super interesting careers that they may not have planned in advance and may not have at all foreseen. And some of the most fascinating people that you've never heard of or not yet met. And so the idea of this series is to bring you together, to explore how careers and lives are actually lived and developed, to look for threads that wind through careers, threads of values and beliefs and insights, unexpected developments, opportunities, the role of serendipity and being open to the new, setbacks and failures, and what you learned from those in terms of change and growth. And also to have our speakers talk about what interesting work they're doing now and what they're looking ahead to doing. So let me just foreshadow that our next speaker is November 18th. Also at noon, Joe Spiker, who went from Wall Street to Peace Corps to a global social enterprise to being executive director of the Autodesk Foundation. And he's going to be talking to us about the future of work. Today, however, is our first and the first person on my list when I thought about path-bending careers and interesting careers was absolutely Shashi. I'm not going to give you a standard introduction because Shashi's going to talk us through his life and his career experiences and his learnings and his multiple jobs and experiences. I will just say, I find his work absolutely groundbreaking. Shashi has taught me about and brought to me research on gender violence in Kashmir, Indian politics, salt-run refrigerators for vaccines. And so Shashi is a lecturer at Haas. He teaches for us on international development and technology. So Shashi's going to take it from here. I'm going to jump in at times just to kind of keep him on his feet, keep things going. If you have questions, we'll pause and have a question and answer at the end. But if you have questions in the meantime, if you would, please chat them to me and then I can get them over to Shashi, okay? So with that, Shashi, let me turn it over to you.
Thank you, Nora. One way to have a path-bending career is to fail at many careers so that you're quite comfortable moving on to the next one. And in fact, as I talk about my career, the work and the implications, more importantly, the implications, we'll see that there's just a lot of serendipity involved, as Nora was saying. So let me get started with sharing a screen, and you should be able to see it any second now. It should be a blank screen now. It's 2020, right? If there's one thing we can agree on, it is the need to do the following, because this is Berkeley, I'm not gonna say it loudly, but there's a lot that's been happening: climate change, growth of nationalism, everything that the Me Too movement has taught us about how men have behaved atrociously throughout history. Biodiversity is gone, inequity is rising, and there's so many problems to be solved. And that means we have to ask ourselves individually and collectively a bunch of tough questions. Right? And when I've succeeded, the few times I've succeeded, it's because I've been able to ask the tough questions. And whenever I've failed, it's because I haven't done a good job of that. So let's sort of collectively go through this individual journey and sort of see what lessons we can learn from that. And I'll say at the outset that I've been fortunate that I've been able to do a lot of things, but I've had a pretty low batting average, right? And one of the things we'll see is that a lot of people optimize for a high batting average, right? And the nice thing about settling for a low batting average is as long as they show up to bat a lot, you get a lot of hits, to use the baseball analogies given the season. We hear a lot about the 1% problem, right? There's a portion of the world that's doing wrong, that's accumulating a ridiculous amount of wealth, and so on and so forth. I actually don't know if the problem is the 1% problem. The way I tend to think about it is, let's say this bar represents the 7.8 billion people on the planet, right? And there's this sort of tiny 1%-ish at one end. That's let's call it the bad, right? And if you do an analysis of uh, the professions of people and how they tend to spend their time and the dedication they show to solving these problems, very unscientifically, let's just assume that it's no more than sort of the good 1% at the other end, right? Now, there's something obvious, right, between the so-called good and the so-called bad, which is this thing in the middle, right? Is it a 1% problem or is it a 98% problem? Which is that I've come to believe that the vast majority of humans, we kind of settle in, right? We're capable of episodic outrage, episodic charity and generosity, but by and large, we're able to settle for a profound degree of indifference. We said, if there's a new normal, who would have told us, if somebody told us a year back that we'd be walking around without seeing anybody, shaking hands, hugging, just walking around masks, would we have believed it? Of course not, right? But now, sort of we've not fully accepted it, but we've settled into that, right? And so our ability to absorb bad shocks and kind of assume it's normal, it's actually pretty profound and pretty troubling. And so what that means is when we hear about children being snatched from their parents and thrown in cages and so on and so forth, we are shocked. When we hear about fires in California and Australia and even on Mount Kilimanjaro, we're shocked, right? But the shock only lasts so long, and then we settle back into our day to day. Let me show you something, and then I won't tell you much about what it is. We'll come back to that, right? So it's a picture of something. And just what follows is a short video. And I'll keep quiet as you're watching the video. It's about a minute or so. And there's no audio. Right. So you're probably wondering what that was. One of my professors in college once taught me a very important lesson. She said, never start a conversation with the topic of human excrement. Well, that was actually a lot of earthworms eating human excrement. And I promise you there's some relevance to what we're talking about. We'll come back to that, but it's one way to get everyone's attention. So let's take a step back and start with this construct I use when I teach in my work, which is it's called the Human Development Index, the HDI. Right? The HDI it's a composite of how the UN and the global development community measures how countries are doing. It combines economic prosperity, health, and education. And what I've done is taken all the countries in the world and divided them into deciles, population deciles. So each decile approximately has 780 million people. And the bottom decile, which you see in red, these are the worst off countries. The top decile, in the green, the best off countries. Not surprisingly, the Western Europe, at least North America, the part of the Canada, the US, Australia, New Zealand, and Japan, these tend to be the countries that we hear of as being wealthy. And they indeed are. They are in the top decile. Then you've got a whole bunch of countries, middle income countries, Latin America, Southeast Asia, and so on, and North Africa, and so on, that are in deciles 2 through 6. Then we get to what's often called the developing world, deciles 7 through 9, which tend to be, that's much of South Asia, some countries in sub-Saharan Africa, and then you've got the bottom decile, which are fragile states. We call them the bottom billion, and so on and so forth. And these are mostly in sub-Saharan Africa. And that begs the question: what causes underdevelopment? What causes countries to be poor? There are lots of theories, and I grew up in India, and I'll come back to that lesson in just a bit. But one of the obvious answers, which I don't think there's a whole lot of disagreement about, is it's colonialism, right? And there are lots of reasons why colonialism causes underdevelopment. And one way to look at it is the following, which is what you had is these powers that took countries that were going on an organic path, but because they wanted to rule, they did this thing called divide and rule. In the process, they dismantled local institutions. They in much of sub-Saharan Africa, for instance, they shifted agriculture from multi-crop to monocrop so that they could get access to these commodities. They made sure that local institutions, local leaders were suppressed, right, so that they could rule easily. And at the end, when they did decolonize, the boundaries were just arbitrary, right? And so, or communities and countries that organically may not have been together, all of a sudden, at the end of independence, they're kind of thrown together, right, with these arbitrary boundaries. And quite often that led to things like civil war, ethnic unrest, and so on and so forth. And even after independence, quite often the powers continue to intervene. Now, in the immediate aftermath of the post-colonial era, you had the Cold War, right? And so a certain type of intervention changed into a different type of intervention, but you had low-income countries struggling to actually be independent. Could have been in some cases because of they had extracted resources, and some version of the colonial powers continued to exert their influence. And how does that manifest itself? Well, we talked about the Human Development Index, right? So if you look at a typical colonizer, their rank is 21. And the lower the number, obviously, the better off a country is. If you look at a country that has been colonized, the average rank is 110. And just by comparison, so the fifth decile somewhere in the middle is, around 90-ish, given that there are 194-ish countries in the world. Now, you could say correlation is not causation. You had to be wealthy in order to colonize. But then if you look at countries that were neither the colonizer nor the colonized, they actually do significantly better than colonized countries. And so again, I said there's a lot of agreement about whether or not colonization caused problems with respect to poverty, but there's actually equal amount of disagreement. And having grown up in India, I totally see how that manifested itself. So where I grew up was in Calcutta, right? It's a big city, bustling, beautiful, lots of history, lots of culture, but also lots of poverty and lots of pollution. Right? And one of the enduring memories of childhood I had was we'd have foreign tourists come and visit. More often than not, they'd be white. They'd come, they'd take pictures of the slum kids. Some of them would go off to the Taj Mahal, others would sort of go to a yoga retreat, and so on and so forth, right? And I'd be curious why they were coming. They'd come take pictures of the kids in the slums, and when I'd ask them, "What are you doing?" the answer would invariably be a version of, "We're here to help." Right? And so put yourself in the shoes of a young child in a country like that, which is, here we are, right? We clearly cannot help ourselves. What we need is tourists coming in their spare time with their spare change, so tossing us a few pennies, and that's kind of the only way we're going to be helped. Imagine what that does to a child's or a community's or a country's sense of agency, right? Of of inherent ability, and it is debilitating. So much so that, and I never realized sort of what sort of cultural impact it had on me. But I remember the first time in 1983 when India actually won a global sporting event. It won the 1983 World Cup. It was sort of an awakening, because wow, we're not so bad after all. Because now things are slightly different now. Obviously, in India, things are very different, with all sorts of craziness happening, ridiculous wealth, and ridiculous levels of violations of human rights, and so on and so forth. But for the longest time, there was this cultural memory of because we are brown, we're just not capable, right? Because the only people who we saw come and help, the only people we saw in global positions of power were white. And the way it manifested itself in my life was, when I was young, I was an athlete, was on the Indian rowing team. And the first time, and this was like, I don't look nearly that badass now, but there was a time when I did, right? The first time I showed up to an international race, it was in the Philippines, I believe, if memory serves me right. And I was racing against a white guy, right? And I had no idea whether he was faster than me or slower than me, but not just but our entire team kind of assumed that I would lose, right? And I turned out I did perfectly fine in that race, right? But imagine walking onto a field, and just by the mere your ethnicity or the color of your skin, you assume you're going to lose. Now, with everything that we're hearing about the Black Lives Matter movement, and sort of systemic racism, as well as sort of inherent hidden bias, this shouldn't be a surprise anymore, right? But back in the day, nobody believed that this thing called unconscious bias existed, and the fact that it had such a deep, it manifests itself so deeply and profoundly in someone. So in the late 80s, I came to the US to study. And truth be told, I was a very mediocre student in India, and very grateful to Goshen College. It's in Indiana. They gave me a scholarship, a full scholarship, pretty much, without which I would not have been able to afford an education. A very interesting thing about Goshen is that it's a Mennonite college. Mennonite, it's an Anabaptist, a Protestant Christian community. A little bit like the Quakers, deeply pacifistic, and what the motto of Goshen College is culture for service. And the ethos actually is very similar to that of Berkeley, which is, everyone believes they have a calling to do service. Now, in Goshen's case, it was very much from a religious Christian missionary point of view. In Berkeley's case, it's obviously, I personally am not very religious, and everyone has their own faith. But in Berkeley's case, my sense is much more from the point of view of the political left. When I lecture, one of the heartwarming things, particularly nowadays, this generation of students, they are seriously committed to making the world a better place. And part of what's heartwarming about teaching kids in Berkeley is that a large number of my students and Nora students and students of those of you who I don't know how many else in this call teach at Cal, but whether you're a student, whether you're part of the community, you will observe that a number of students will actually want to go overseas and do good work. Just like Goshen, right? So you couldn't graduate from Goshen College if you didn't take a semester and go to a developing country and do service. So let's say that one of, whether it's a graduate of Goshen, whether it's a graduate of Berkeley, the typical student goes to Kenya and wants to solve poverty there, right? We are very proud. We recognize those students. We give them awards if they do decent work, and so on and so forth. Now, let's rethink that particular context. Let's say we had the best, the top graduate of the top university in Kenya, who wants to show up to the US and say, hey, I want to solve poverty in the US. What would our reaction be? We'd sort of, we would chuckle, right? So inherent in this idea of culture for service, whether it's at Goshen, whether it's at Berkeley, is, I think, this unconscious bias around cultural superiority. We don't like to think that. And I don't think we actually deliberately believe that. But the mere fact that we would encourage a student, a graduate of Berkeley or of a Goshen, who's never spent any meaningful time in a developing country, right? Because they care and because they are from a culture, we believe they are able to go to a entirely different culture with enormously complicated problems, right? And somehow solve poverty. But when we look at the possibility of someone from that kind of a context coming here to help, we find it amusing. So the even from that age in college, the fundamental issue I came to believe was that we needed to decolonize this idea of service. Global poverty is a very, very complex issue. It's not just about showing up and building a latrine and teaching a class, right? These are structural problems that go back, its roots they go back generations to colonialism, right? And it's about building an economy, it's about building civilian institutions, it's about building civil society, and a multi-generational economic base. It goes so far beyond just being a social entrepreneur who's a good idea or showing up for a charitable work. And in my work, I found that where the aid industry and the development industry often goes wrong is there. So let me pause there, before we go on to the next chapter around science and technology. Nora, anyone, thoughts, questions? Please feel free to type Nora questions. And Nora, if you have questions, let's pause and talk about how this, particularly in the Berkeley context, because we have lots of young people who want to make the world a better place.
Okay, well, I confess I'm most curious about what comes next in your life, but let me go back for a minute. How did you decide to go to Goshen College? I understand they gave you a scholarship, but what gave you the impetus or the motivation? What were you thinking when you went there?
Well, let me put it this way. I applied to 3 places: MIT, I believe it was Clark University in Worcester, Massachusetts, and Goshen. And so one place didn't accept me. Another place accepted me but didn't give me a scholarship. The third place accepted me and gave me a scholarship, right? So you can figure out the math there, right? And remember, I was a perfectly mediocre student, right? And it was a great, tremendous opportunity. And in India those days, if you weren't for a middle class family, if you weren't a physician or an engineer, you were nothing, right? There was no respect for any other profession. And they weren't, in the late 80s, there weren't that many great engineering colleges either, right? So now there are many more, but the competition was intense, so much so that, take the IITs that you may have heard of, the Indian Institutes of Technology, somewhere approximately 1 out of every 100,000 students would get accepted, right? And I was not a great student in those days. So, so Goshen was, you talked about serendipity. They seemed to like my profile. They seemed to like that I had sort of, well-rounded interests, and fortunately they were in a generous mood and gave me a scholarship, right? So again, it's a college I'd heard about in casual conversation, to your point around serendipity.
Okay, why don't you go ahead and talk about your next chapter, and then
Can you
after that.
Can you still see my screen, the presentation? Great.
No, Mark,
No.
I think we need to go back to just Shashi.
There, I think you should see the screen, right?
Yes.
Great. So I graduated, in '91. I went to UMass Amherst to do a PhD in artificial intelligence and robotics. This was what I'd call the second generation of AI. We didn't even have digital cameras those days, or at least if we did, I believe, towards the end of my dissertation research was when we first got digital cameras. And my research was in computational vision, machine vision, essentially. What that means is helping autonomous vehicles see, helping robotic things see. Here's what that means. And specifically, here's the kind of research that I got involved in. What do you see in front of you? It's a stop sign, right? Now, obviously, if you look at the stop sign on the left, you can tell that it's reddish, blah, 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 right? Now, the one on the right, there's not a whole lot of red there. There's a little bit of red, a lot of reflection of the sun. Yet, we know that it's a stop sign, even though most of the word stop is not visible. In fact, most of it is not red, right? So turns out that humans have, so if you look, underneath that stop sign, you see a couple of white pieces of paper. That was part of the experiment, right? If you look at that white pieces of paper under a setting sun, it looks reddish orangish. If you turn it around and look at it under blue sky, its physical color is actually bluish. On this overcast day, its physical color is actually kind of grayish, right? Yet we know that it's white because humans have this mechanism called color constancy, where we take a whole lot of other context, most of which is completely unconscious, and we through that mechanism we figure out what the actual color, the intrinsic color of the surface we're looking at is, and machines don't have that ability. They have that ability, and what I'd worked on was the first generation of autonomous vehicles, part of which was actually figuring out what a stop sign looked like. Of course, nowadays when you look at, it's been a long time. Nowadays, machines are so much smarter, and so much faster, right? So, the way we would do it those days was, so this was actually, we did some research at a GM test facility. So this is a sort of a cordoned off road where GM tests their new vehicles for safety and so on and so forth. And so there's this random thing on the road in front of you, right? And so part of what we had to figure out is, well, in those days, we didn't even have very good radar systems. We only kind of had cameras. And so based on this, we'd have to figure out, well, is that a piece of trash? Is that something else? Is it just a divot in the road, and so on and so forth? I won't bore you with the technical details, but the research ended up working fine. With the algorithm, we were able to figure out that yes, it looks like there's some stuff there, and we'd block it, and we get some false positives, and so on and so forth, right? In those days, the particular algorithm that I developed for my thesis was, on one hand, remarkable in the sense that in 98% success. On the other hand, what that meant was if you had an autonomous vehicle, 2 out of every 98 people who cross the path you'd run over, right? And so clearly, it was the first generation and long way to go. The reason this research was made possible is actually, it's a little more scary, which is that even today, most of the advanced research in things like robotics and so on and so forth is funded by the Defense Department. And in those days, it was no exception, right? So even though most of the users we tested the stuff on were civilian, in some cases actually good. So for instance, we used satellite images to figure out the depletion of population of certain species based on color and so on and so forth. But the work was actually funded by DARPA. And we actually had to test on stuff like autonomous target recognition. So they would give us these pictures of tanks, and essentially we'd have to figure out where they are and so on and so forth, right? And the broader point being, this got very old very quickly, right? Because the last thing personally I wanted to do was do defense research. But a couple of other very, very important lessons, which is the technology subsidy. Truth be told, if it hadn't been for that kind of investment by the government, today we wouldn't have all these amazing technologies that we can count on. If DARPA, which funded this, hadn't invested in the internet, they may not have been a Google or an Apple or all. Today's technology is possible because the US government and the governments of wealthy countries have been able to invest massive amounts of public money, government money, in creating some sort of a platform, and therefore a subsidy for for-profit companies. The next issue is that, as I was solving those problems, just from a pure technology point of view, it became very obvious that it would take me like 3 hours to run that algorithm to show the pictures. Right now, you could do it in less, it's like a microsecond or something of that sort, right? So what was obvious is that it wasn't a question of algorithmic sophistication. It was really a question of force. Machines were going to get faster and faster. Sensors were going to get better. They were going to get more granular. We'd have more of them. So we can combine all of these things and compute, and we just have to wait. And truth be told, it's not like the world needed autonomous vehicles then, not like the world needs them now. But so that part of science got very boring for me. Which is, A, I didn't want to do defense research. B, one of the very, very interesting constructs I learned in graduate school was complexity theory, right? How solvable is a problem and under what circumstances? And that's, I'd say that I learned more about being a scientist by understanding complexity theory than any other individual discipline, right? And so it became obvious to me that there was nothing mathematical we could do to solve this. The only thing that would happen is just with each generation of computing, things would get faster and cheaper and better. And so the scientist in me kind of got bored. The third thing I realized is what I call the Viagra problem, right? Which is, before you let your imagination run wild, the fact that Viagra exists, whereas a vaccine for malaria doesn't exist, right? If there is a market that's willing to pay, do we believe that Pfizer can't actually develop a malaria vaccine? Of course they can. They just don't wanna. They don't care because there isn't enough money to be made, right? So it seemed to me like there are these fundamental problems that needed to be solved. A lot of the problems I grew up with in India, some of those would happen on their own because of just the trajectory of things. But there was the problem 1 and problem 3, which is, where is that subsidy going to come from for low-income countries? And 3, where there isn't a big market draw, how do you solve this problem? So I decided to join the corporate world. Spent a few years at McKinsey, probably a couple of years longer than I should have, but it was a phenomenal experience. I learned a lot about the corporate world, about so much of what I've been able to do just from a solving complex problems point of view. I think has been made possible because of the training I got at McKinsey. Perhaps independent of what I learned about the business world, I'd say the most important lesson I learned was this thing called hypothesis-driven problem solving without enough data. Scientists, if you're a good scientist, you don't reach a conclusion unless there's enough data. In the real world, there is never going to be enough data. Right? And even today, in the world of global development, right, you have people who, there's this whole notion of evidence-based results and evidence-based learning. I actually don't like that approach, simply because, going back to complexity theory, one of the things that happens is that whenever data is shown, it is very clear that data is not representative of the universe. Therefore, you take n data points, you extrapolate from that, but quite often that extrapolation is incorrect. And in the field of global development, that happens way too often, right? But the lesson I learned at McKinsey was how to get good at extrapolating and interpolating with fewer and fewer data points, which is, you have to have an appreciation for the underlying complexity and the underlying dimensionality of the problem you're working on, right? What that means in the real world is, let's say we're working on electricity access, right? You kind of have to figure out, look, what are the underlying economics of people who are willing to pay? What are the policy implications? What is the science and the engineering of electricity, right? Where is the overall utility business going, right? And without an appreciation for that n-dimensional problem, we'll never be able to make a dent. The second lesson I learned was, let me put it this way. Spending 70, and McKinsey is kind of the nirvana of a lot of careers, right? And to me, it was fabulous. But working ridiculously hard doing PowerPoints to make insurance companies more profitable is about exactly as exciting as it sounds, right? And so this is the lesson I teach my MBA students is that, there is value. You learn a lot, but it is so easy to just get caught up in the day-to-day of the job, right? And sort of celebrate yourself because you're in this bubble where, where it's so easy to get lost in a bubble where people are comparing the size of the Porsches, right? And it just, and so definition of success ends up being very, very skewed, depending on what bubble you're in. The third lesson I learned was even though McKinsey was and is an amazing institution, and strategy consulting is actually a pretty interesting field. When you look at it in the context of the big global financial crisis from 2008, right? The vast majority of those big companies that went down and took the global economy down with them were our clients, right? So as smart as we believed we were, as much money as honestly we were getting paid, the big question was our work monumentally incompetent or monumentally irrelevant or both, right? And so, the sort of, I think organically, I would have probably reached the end of my sort of corporate life, but this kind of accelerated. Right? And coming back to the bubble, and this is one of the last slides I show my students, which is, unfortunately, way too much of the world and way too many people define success in a very conventional method, right? You have this ladder where you go to a good college, get a degree, get an advanced degree. If you're able to get a good entry job, you have a benchmark of the salary and so on and so forth. And then sort of over, middle management, and then, eventually sort of you reach nirvana, right? And even at a place like Berkeley, right? If you do the pie chart of students, sadly, way too many people focus on this. The other lesson that humans haven't learned about money is demand is much easier to control than supply. Right? If you live a simple life, you actually don't need a whole lot. And the more you want, the easier it is to become a victim of the trappings of wealth, right? And truth be told, even those of us who live reasonably middle class lives in the Bay Area, we have so much more than we need, right? And from a climate footprint point of view, right? If the whole world, and we all believe we are ecologically responsible and so on and so forth, but if everybody in the world lived like we do, there wouldn't be a planet, right? So even for some strange surreal set of reasons, ended up deciding to make a documentary movie about the India-Pakistan conflict and cricket diplomacy, right? The circumstances are too serendipitous and bizarre to recount, but it was I wanted to play cricket in India. I was never very good at it. Got a chance to play in the US. And the only team that would there was actually a big league in Chicago, which is where I used to live. Because I wasn't very good, the only team that would take me was a team that had been kicked out of the league the year before because they slashed the umpire's tires. And so they were willing to settle for anybody, which is why they took me. But it also happened to be an almost all Pakistani team. I was the only Indian on the team, and as open-minded as I like to think I was, went through a profound recognition of my own hidden biases and so on, and learned a lot about the history of the two countries. And whenever you grow up in any particular country, it's the moment you realize your country doesn't stand for absolute good, it is a moment of shock, right? And so I went through that in the process of making this movie. So I'll show you a brief clip from the movie. Let me see if I can do that smoothly. Give me a second. Right. So this is the first 90 seconds or so of the movie, and I'll keep quiet while it's playing. So yeah, what this movie does is it goes back and forth between, let me turn this off. It goes back and forth between the story of this team in Chicago that I was a part of, and the geopolitics and the history of India and Pakistan and Bangladesh, and and sort of how things came to be. Um, uh, Talk about sort of the role of religion, the role of nationalism. In the process, I got to spend a lot of time in Pakistan. My friends gave me a fake ID, and I was able to spend time with people who just politely called militants. And realize that it's actually a lot more complicated than any one of us would believe. No one's born a terrorist, right? It takes something to get them there. And it's a problem. These are not problems that happen in isolation. India has a part to play in it. The Soviet Union has a part to play in it. The US has a part to play in it. And without that sort of complex appreciation of the history, it's impossible to even tell a story, let alone solve these problems. And it was, again, a wonderful experience for me. Just learned, and I was one of the few people from India who had a chance to travel to Pakistan. More than anything else, it gave me this appreciation for what it takes. Why would you want to kill yourself to kill others, right? I have friends who are former militants who had sort of gone into training camps, and now they're doing all sorts of good, productive things. But that kind of an appreciation, that, as I said, I would have probably switched careers anyway. But at that point, I decided to fundamentally switch careers and join the social sector. So now I'm already approaching my fourth career, right? So there was the academic, there's the corporate thing, the filmmaker, which lasted, thankfully not very long, because I made one decent movie, but it's really difficult to sustain a successful career as a filmmaker. You have to be very resilient and very strong, and I'm not that. I joined Dahlberg, which is, as you may have heard of it, it's a wonderful consulting company focused on, essentially started by ex-McKinsey people, but focused on the social sector. Worked with the various UN agencies, foundations, companies on their social responsibility charters, and so on. And in many ways, so I started the San Francisco office around 2010 is when I started teaching at Berkeley as well. And a part of me thought that, my moral burdens would ease if I had sort of started working in this sector. I also realized, unfortunately, that the whole international development sector is just awfully broken. So my clients included everyone from UN peacekeeping, and in fact, because of my experience with militancy and so on, I started the human rights and conflict practice. But because I started the office here, there weren't that many people in the San Francisco office. So I ended up working on climate change, on food security, on health, and so on and so forth, a broad range of issues. And in the process, I got to look at how NGOs fund their work. I got to look at how they raise money. I got to look at how foundations spend their money, right? And what I did was, in the background, every time I'd come across a budget, I'd kind of do the pie chart or the waterfall chart of how that money is spent, right? And in a few years, I aggregated all that and put it together. And here's what it looked like, which is, total amount of funding, right? Let's see, whatever it is, right? So this is across a large number of grants. And let's say that the average amount was 10 million, right? Half of the money was going to foreign staff. Right? Now go back to what I mentioned earlier about just in addition to the fact that it's inefficient use of money. Think of the implications of that, where you have foreign, typically white staff going to a developing country and leading the work, right? Living in these enclaves, these expatriate enclaves away from the rest of the community. Then you'd have a good 30% spent on what I call non-local expenses. One factoid I learned is, the one organization across I must have looked at 50, 60 grants. the organization that benefited the most from this was actually Toyota, because every NGO working in the field needed a Land Cruiser, right? So they put that in the grant. And so there was that. There were all these international hotels, right? So because expats tend to live in branded international hotels, right? And so sure, a lot of the local staff, the waiters and the housekeepers were local, but the profits and the bulk of the money was actually leaving the country. Then you had local expenses. And so obviously sort of you buy stuff locally and so on and so forth, some local groceries. And unfortunately, in many cases, a lot of that money also left the country because the brands were international, right? Then you had high wage local staff, high skilled local staff, and low skilled local staff. And that was a tiny portion of the overall spend, right? And so this was just heartbreaking that we were essentially creating an industry of intermediaries who actually were they're moving the needle, but not by a whole lot, and certainly not efficiently. And so what I would the way I built a sort of an assessment framework for our own work, and this is part of what I teach our students, right? And what I would do is every project I came across, I would rank it on the basis of this. I won't go through the details of each one of these dimensions, but this was the average score across. I must have seen 120, 150 projects, right? And what I do is rate them, and they were barely touching a B minus at best, right? So this is how broken the industry was. And the other thing I learned was that remember the earlier ladder of success I showed for the conventional world, I learned that it actually wasn't that much better for the social sector, right? Which is that, sure, everybody, you kind of needed to reach a certain sort of Maslow hierarchy rung, if you will. And what I found is that a lot of people were really enjoying working in interesting professions. It's great to have conversations with friends and family about, honestly, I did that myself, right? Which is go to Darfur and, great photographs, great dinner conversation, right? But it's not like Darfur ended up being any better off because I spent 2 weeks there, right? So I would say that, a good 80-90% of the professionals in the global development industry are in this category I'd call interesting, right? What people really seem to aspire to, the vast majority, is becoming influential, which is doing the TED Talk, being the talking head, right? And sort of putting their name forward. And that's obviously influence is good if you can wield it well, but that seemed to be the aspiration. And almost, very, very few people truly, I found, were willing to do what it takes to be genuinely impactful. And so, this is what I leave my students with, which is, look, if you're picking this profession, it's going to be interesting. Okay, just make sure you leapfrog influence. It's not a bad thing to be influential, but the holy grail, the target, the end game has to be being impactful. And if development is about undoing the effects of colonialism, we're not going to fix that with a nicer, kinder, gentler form of colonialism. And that's unfortunately where the global development field is. It's changing a little bit, but in my opinion, not fast enough. And so, a few years went by, and as I was thinking about sort of what's it going to take to change the game fundamentally, there had been up to that point in history a few solid examples of game changers. So, for instance, the Green Revolution, and partly in Latin America, but in Asia, right? It saved hundreds of millions of people from absolute actual starvation, right? And it was a truly systematic approach. It had science, it had local institution building, capacity building, and so on and so forth. And the question I asked myself was, what does it take to actually, when does a society in a country graduate from developing to some semblance of developed? And so I decided it was these four, and I believe that civil society is a multi-generational thing. It's not going to happen overnight. I don't believe that. I didn't believe I could move that needle. Likewise with accountable institutions, where I believed I could make a big difference, given my background in sort of business and science and engineering, was building on the idea of a leapfrog infrastructure had started to take shape because of how telecom and smartphones were starting to really proliferate. Solar was starting to proliferate. So there was the sense that countries and infrastructures need not build the same old way, right? A number of countries were sort of, whether India, Kenya, Nigeria, right? There was plenty of poverty, but there was enough of what I'd call, and I'm politically pretty far left, right? I'm sort of very much feel the burn, if you know what I mean, right? But I do believe that there's something to be said for a demand-based model, an accountable model, where if you take an NGO that's just showing up and providing free services, there's no accountability in that, right? If you switch that around, and if people got fired because they're not delivering, right? Or if the consumers, if the end beneficiaries had a choice, they could, instead of choosing your service or your product, they'd have the freedom to choose something else. I found that and I call it market-based, even though I don't mean sort of laissez-faire free markets, right? Something to be said for building on that kind of a market-based model. We talked about new generation technologies, and what had also been happening, and we're sort of seeing some of the negative effects of that is globalization and global supply chains, right? It is actually quite a remarkable thing that so many interesting and sophisticated things are being made in China, right? It is quite a remarkable thing that so much software is being written in India, because 30 years back, this wasn't the case, right? And so, again, lots of unintended consequences of this, but it also is a platform to do lots of positive things, right? And so on the basis of that, around 2015, when the UN Sustainable Development Goals were announced, we did this study called the 50 Breakthroughs Study. It identifies methodically, in every issue affecting the global poor, what are the 50 most important new technologies required. And I must say that, intellectually, this is the most satisfying body of work I've done. And a lot of colleagues were part of the team. But had it not been from a training as a scientist and sort of in business and having spent time in conflict-prone zones and so on and so forth, I don't think the study would have been as interesting or as influential as it's turned out to be. But it's been recognized by the UN Commission on Science and Technology for Development as the technology backbone for the Sustainable Development Goals. What we do with those 50 breakthroughs is we distribute them along these two axes, right? One is commercial attractiveness. What I mean by that is one of the 50 breakthroughs is a low-cost smartphone. Now, a smartphone, there are huge market forces driving that, right? So it's quite attractive to large multinational companies, whether it's an Apple, whether it's a Samsung, or knockoffs, right? So those things are going to happen on their own. At the other end of the spectrum, things like the malaria vaccine that we talked about, where there's very limited commercial value. Right. So there's no, companies don't have an incentive to invest in the R&D and the technology and the product development that you'd have to do, right? The other axis is the kind of technology and R&D sophistication required. Is it available typically only in labs in wealthy countries? Is it available to research institutions only in emerging economies? Or is it pretty broadly available to private companies in the emerging economies as well? And we focus on that space over there, which is, it is pretty sophisticated technology, not easily available to the private sector in emerging economies. But if it did become available, they could build attractive large-scale businesses on the basis of this. Ordinarily, maybe they could do it, maybe they couldn't do it, but they'd rather not invest, they'd rather not take the risk. Now, go back to what I said about 20 minutes back around what I learned from the research at UMass, which is the need for de-risking this R&D, which is what DARPA did, right? It wasn't just de-risking, but they invested the kind of money that a private company just wouldn't be able to, right? And so the model it led us to start employing is, well, what if we could use philanthropic money to build a technology, build a suite of technologies or a system or whatever, right? Essentially de-risk it for these businesses so that they don't have to worry about, so some of the technologies we build, let's say we have a 1 in 10 chance of succeeding, right? They don't have to worry about taking that risk. But once it becomes market ready, once we're able to demonstrate its commercial feasibility, they can build a business in a way that there's no way we can. Right? The most interesting example of that is in the case of solar mini grids and electricity access. The solar mini grid is, as you can tell from the pictures, it is an isolated grid, and it's ideally suited for a village in maybe 500 people, all the way up to a couple thousand people. It can take up a half a football field to a football field. And when we started this project, solar power and solar mini grids were quite expensive. In fact, even up to 2 years back, it was quite expensive. And this is what India had just, a bunch of NGOs in India had just launched a major collective effort to build 1,000 mini grids in India. And this is in the state of Bihar, right? And this is what the plant looked like. And most of the actual work was being done in that building you see in the back. If you go inside, here's what it looks like. Now, it's got power electronics, it's got the batteries, and it looks like a fire waiting to happen. Right? It's very poorly engineered. Obviously, the technicians who are doing this are doing the best they can, but they kind of have to make do, right? And each mini grid took 2 to 3 months to build. And by our assessment, based on what we thought people could pay, if you were the typical much of India is not as poor as the poorest countries in sub-Saharan Africa, right? So the typical village in India, instead of $2 a day or $1.25, the income is somewhere around $3 to $5, right? The cost of power was still 3-4 times what they could pay. And as you went down the economic ladder, it got more and more expensive, right? And so, even though the cost of solar panels was going down, you had a whole system. Mini grids have so much. You have batteries, you have the inverters, you have the actual grid itself, and so on and so forth. And so we had to somehow take it down from something like $30 a month to $15 a month, $7.50 a month, and so on and so forth, right? And the way we did that was, I got very lucky. I was able to find 2 or 3 people who happened to be looking for jobs, who had between them built more solar mini grids than the rest of the world put together, right? So again, serendipity. At the same time, we realized that, and I'm not going to geek out on this too much, right? We can only do so much reducing the cost of power. We have to make appliances energy efficient, and you have to make them affordable, right? So long story short, we approached a company called Tata Power, which India's largest utility. Actually, I'd say one of the largest utilities in the world, but they primarily were focused on the urban market. We went to them and said, look, we think we can build this thing that we call a utility in a box, where instead of 2 to 3 months, you can actually build it, you can install it in 2 to 3 days. We can drive the cost down by more than 50%. We'll raise grant money for that. But if we do, we want you to promise that you'll make a good faith attempt to commercialize this. And so, so they agreed. We worked together for 3 years. They gave us land. They allowed us to experiment with their grid-tied facilities. And today we have a system that honestly, so from here, I can see, I'll tell you where we are today, but I can see what every user in every village that's using this in any country that we've deployed this is doing, right? It is more sophisticated. Well, I would say more sophisticated than PG&E, but that wouldn't be saying a whole lot, right? But certainly, orders of magnitude more sophisticated than that, right? Here's what we've been able to achieve. So Tata Power has committed $1 billion to this. We've launched jointly what will be the world's largest utility, 10,000 villages, 25 million people. It'll have a huge climate footprint reduction. Here's what's heartwarming about this is that we launched this formally. The utility was created on November 1 of last year. Now we were doing some sort of background work, and the goal was to start constructing in February of 2020. Well, we know what happened in February of 2020, right? So, believe it or not, they've already, despite COVID and despite all the lockdowns, they've already built more mini grids this year. They built over 200 or something, right? More than that were built in India up to this point, right? and it looks like we'll hit 500 this year. And again, the nice thing about working with a company like Tata is they know what they're doing, right? They don't need to be on the TED stage talking. They don't need to be great social entrepreneurs, right? They don't need to be heroes. What I love about them is they're boring and they get shit done, right? And that's what the world needs more of. It's just boring people who don't need to be heroes, who don't need halos on their head. They just get stuff done, and that's what they're doing, right? And we are well on our way, and we're currently actually. So the Indian government has gotten behind this. We're currently working on a plan to go well beyond the 10,000 villages to something like 50 or 100,000 villages, and take it outside India as well. Now that brings us back. Yes, Nur?
I just wanted to make sure to let you know, people have questions.
Great. All right, let's pause.
Okay. So questions, people, you can just call them out or type them into the chat.
And Nora, if you have questions too, please, I'm sure that.
Sure.
Can I ask a question?
Please.
Yeah. Thank you, Shashi. This has been an amazing presentation. I'm so glad I joined this. One thing I wanted to understand, you have mentioned this a couple of times that we need boring people. We don't need people who are just going out and just talking about themselves. What I've realized, and I've been struggling with this for quite some time, is this that the reward structure is designed in that way in our society. And at the basic level, we as human beings, we are driven by our cognitive is designed in that way that we want to run towards reward. So for instance, I've been trying to raise some money for non-profits. The best thing that worked for me was telling that, oh, we'll put your name and face there, we'll talk about you and this and that. And then I got a lot of money.
Yeah.
That's it. Like before this, I had tried explaining the impact that we are making. Nothing worked as much as just saying that we will show the world that you are giving so much money to us. So, and this is a problem that I've been facing for quite some time. And I realized just going through my own life as well in India, I'm originally from India, majority of the people who were extremely smart, they were driven by academic success, and that was all it. And that was because that's how our reward system was designed. Our parents told us, go study, that's all you care about. After that, get into engineering, that's all you care about. And then get a job, and that's all you care about. So I've realized that maybe one thing that we need to do is go back to the education and somehow change the reward system. This is where I am, honestly, and I'm trying to identify what can be done. I just wanted to hear some thoughts of you. You've mentioned so many times in this presentation that we have these scientists and engineers who get all the data and try to make the decision based on that. But in real world, it's all about being open to challenges, having these hypotheses, being empathetic, not running in the rat race, not looking for these kind of rewards. Sounds great, but how do we make that?
Great. So let me give a two-part answer, right? One is look, you've got to be able to inspire people, funders otherwise. You've got to be able to inspire your colleagues, your stakeholders, right? If you're going to do big things, that won't happen without inspiring people.
Yeah.
Right. Likewise with funders, as I said, right? You've got to be able to sell. But the question is, what's the end game? To me, there's a big difference between being inspiring and sort of being, I do my share of, sadly, my share of TED Talks, right? But honestly, it's a little bit like what I said about the corporate world and sort of monetary success, right? Which is with fame and wanting to be the sort of a well-known speaker and so on and so forth, right? Again, demand is so much easier to control than supply, right? Which is, you got to do it. It's an asset, right? But that cannot be the end game, right? And I worry that far too much of the energy is taken up by people who that's all they do, right? And without an appreciation for the boring stuff. And so that's one. The second thing is, you mentioned sort of structural change. Sadly, going back to that 98% problem, right? Sadly, so a part of me has always wanted to work on human rights, right? And I've sort of dabbled with leaving development and going to human rights. And I ultimately decided not to because I think that I would rather bet on providing electricity to 100 million people than changing the hearts and minds of 100 million people, right? Because here is, so the villages we're working in India right now, in Uttar Pradesh and Bihar and so on and so forth, right? This is almost a ground zero for where Muslims are being massacred, where the Dalits are being massacred, right? And it's well, massacred, killed anyway, right, without any consequences. And I've come to believe that sort of counting on humans to do the right thing is not always a winning proposition, right? So it's a little pessimistic, but yeah, look, things will change. They'll take their time. We just don't have time. In the meantime, we have to get stuff done, which is why I personally focus on the stuff that I believe where we can move the needle. Cool.
Anyone?
Thank you.
All right. Well, I did promise to come back to the topic of human excrement, so I will. Remember this? 1 second. Yeah, so remember this, right? The video. So turns out that farmers have known this for a while, which is that earthworms actually, they love manure. Right? And some scientists have been dabbling with using earthworms to digest and get rid of human waste as well. But the process has been complicated because the density of human fecal waste is different from cow dung and horse manure, right? And so there's a process, there's a particular mechanism that actually sort of, I didn't do much of the scientific work, my colleagues did. But turns out you can actually build a layering system, and essentially it's a combination of several very, very inexpensive materials. But essentially, this can be a ridiculously inexpensive, very, very effective sanitation system. It is strictly speaking not legal, but I actually have one of these in my home in Oakland, California. It is very effective, meaning that so that's what goes into it. Right? It is just raw sewage. That's what comes out of it. In principle, you could drink it. I wouldn't encourage it, but certainly it can be used for irrigation. The water can be reused as grey water, right? It is cleaner, honestly, than drinking water in a lot of cases. The vast, 99% of the pathogens, nitrates, phosphates, BOD, COD, they all get broken down. It is, it's been certified by a number of regulatory bodies, and we're on the way to some scale up. We've got four types of installations. The most ambitious one is a municipal sewage treatment plant where, as many of you know, in developing countries, sewage networks just dump into clean waterways, right? And just make them absolutely filthy. So we were commissioned by the city government of Pune in India to divert one of the sewer pipes, treat it, and the water is then used for irrigation. So you see a lot of green space around it. So we have lots of community gardens and things of that sort that water is used to irrigate. A smaller version of that is used for apartment buildings and factories and so on. And then at the least expensive is for outhouses, particularly in rural settings, where the actual toilet part of it, we can do in $25 essentially. Right now, this is treating the waste of 100,000 people in India, and we just got asked by the Department of Health in Hawaii, which actually faces a pretty surprisingly terrible water pollution problem, to try and test it there. So once COVID lifts, we're hoping to do that as well. I was gonna talk about a couple more things. Nora, are there more questions?
Let's see. Anybody questions? I have a couple if nobody else does.
Yeah.
Anyone?
Hey, this is Jamie. I have a quick question if it's okay to jump in now.
Please.
Cool. I was curious when you were talking earlier about the strategy of sort of using philanthropic funds or government funds potentially to de-risk the business investments. I'm wondering what your stance is on if societies should reap the rewards from those funds, or if those should be, or the de-risking funds, or if those should be only returned to the businesses. I know some people have an opinion that a government subsidizing innovation and then all of the benefits from that are just accrued within the private sector as opposed to being circled back into government investment.
Yeah, I mean, look, again, it's a very, very complex, great question, right? And the answer is obviously complicated, right? Meaning that, it wouldn't make sense, it wouldn't make any sense to have public investment or philanthropic investment in, I just make up a crazy example, right? Say tobacco, right? Because clearly there's nothing good that comes out of it, right? Everything we're talking about is in the context of public goods, right? Meaning that the services, there are two parts of this. One is who benefits from the products and services. The second is what happens to the financial returns, right? Obviously, if someone is making 20, 30% returns, you could argue that there was too much of a subsidy, right? It is unlikely that just in terms of pure returns, it's unlikely that this will make any, if it's truly impact-based, it's highly unlikely that it'll make anything more than mid-single digits in terms of return, right? So that's clearly below market. On the other hand, if you think about where the government gets its money from, it's from taxes, right? And how are taxes generated? Well, you kind of have to have a private sector. In a lot of low-income countries, there isn't enough of a private sector, because what a private sector does, A, it pays taxes, B, it employs people. And if you look at the sort of the economic pyramid in wealthy countries, right, you kind of have, it's a true pyramid where you have just a lot of activity going on in the bottom levels, right? And that's where most of the tax dollars get generated. Those tax dollars then can get reinvested in whatever way the government sees fit. In low-income countries, though, there really isn't much of a formal economy, right? And so, to me, going back to one of the things, slides I mentioned earlier, they're two separate things. One is, how do you build a vibrant, accountable private sector? So you're creating lots of jobs, as opposed to the traditional NGO aid model, right? Where you're just paying these intermediaries too much money, right? And the second thing is, what's an appropriate level of return / reinvestment, right? Again, so I mean, they're not easy answers, but it is, it's easy to oversimplify the question. But I'm glad you asked it. Thank you.
Well, thank you.
Any other questions?
Great. Right. So, it's the part of switching careers is taking risk, right? Because, look, you could do the Jennifer Doudna thing, which is pick a field and sort of nail it, right? Just, that is, I never thought of myself as talented enough to do that, right? So if you're not going to be Jennifer, right? So given that most of us sort of pick a thing and kind of stick to it, right? Sticking to one of those ladders I talked about. The one thing I've learned is it's okay to fail, right? And there's a story I tell. One of my first world championships in rowing was, my first race. I looked to my right, there was the Olympic gold medalist. I looked to my left, and the next lane over was the bronze medalist. I thought I have arrived, right? It's a 2-kilometer race. The first 50 meters, I was doing great, right? And then next 50 meters, they got ahead. And by the time the race finished, they were so far ahead that, it was almost time to start the next race, right? The second event, it was the Olympic silver medalist, and the results were kind of the same. Still got my ass kicked, right? Third race, no Olympic medalist whatsoever, right? I still got my ass kicked, right? So at the end of it, a part of me felt dejected. Part of me felt like, that was fun to actually show up here. I used to train 8 hours a day for that thing, right? And there is a certain joy in, obviously every athlete wants to be that Olympic medalist, right? But there is the journey is actually worth the price. And if you're not afraid to fail, what's the worst thing that happens when you fail, right? You can pick we can pick ourselves up. We, at least I imagine, I don't want to be presumptuous about those of us on this call, but we can withstand failure, right? Just because of where we live, the education we have, and so on and so forth. And that resilience I found actually is very, very valuable. Even whether you're switching careers, whether it's you dealing with unforeseen failures and shocks in life. And so that brings me to this lesson I share with my students and my colleagues, right? Which is in our narrow space of technology innovation, right? So what are the things you need to succeed? Well, on one hand, how good is your technology? The other is how solvable is the intrinsic problem, right? Just those two things, right? Well, maybe you've got the business complexity. You've got, our stakeholders happy with you, right? They're your partners and so on and so forth. How well are we executing, right? Is sort of funding okay, or are funders changing their mind about what they want to fund, right? What about externalities in the ecosystem? How are you working together as a team, right? This is kind of an n-dimensional problem, right? So the likelihood that everything's going to go well on any given day is pretty low. Right. So your typical day kind of looks like this, right? It is very, very volatile. You'll have these highs, you'll have these lows, right? And if you go along on that ride, and this is now obviously a little bit of a metaphor for life as well, right? Which is they're going to be highs, they're going to be lows, right? If you go on, if you get super excited about the highs, or you beat yourself about the lows, you just burn out, right? So what I tell, and this is a lesson, honestly, the only thing that keeps me sane in my job is three things, right? First of all, just sort of try to manage the process so you're avoiding the worst of the worst. It's possible, virtually, I'd say 90+% of the mistakes I've made in life and the mistakes I still continue to make in life are actually avoidable, which is good process management, right? Second is, again, you can't go up and down the amplitude. You've got to be a little zen, which is, there'll be great days, won't get too excited. There'll be terrible days, won't get too dejected, right? So to try and stay in that middle band. And the third is around resilience, which is you're gonna hit bottom. We have to be able to pick ourselves up, right? If you're gonna solve big problems, and boy, if there was ever a time to solve big problems, this is it, right? We need so much. We'll see how Tuesday goes. But so much rebuilding needs to be done, and we just need to be resilient as individuals and societies. And
so along those lines, Shashi, along those lines, the question is, how do you stay inspired and focused on making a real impact? And especially when you get discouraged and it might seem easier just to be influential.
Well, So this is for everybody else in the group. Right? So Nora interviewed me when I showed up to teach at the Haas, right? And I was able to convince her that I knew a lot. But truth is, I actually didn't know that much, right? I found that the best way to learn was to teach, right? Meaning that I sort of had to do all this research, right? And the responsibility of teaching made me learn a lot. To answer your question more specifically, Nora, there are even today, how many people are scared about what's going to happen? I have, what's going to happen next week, right? Same thing with our work, right? The responsibility of inspiring people forces me to inspire myself, right? So I find myself much more inspired when I try to inspire others than when I try to inspire myself, right? And, again, sort of, the world needs to be unpacked, right? Sorry, you can bleep me out later, right? There's no time for being down, right? And so, the easy answer is, what's the option and what's the alternative?
So I have a question for you, follow on to that, Shashi. We have a number of people that I recognize on here who are going to be in S cubed, which you're familiar with, team members or team leads. We have a number of Berkeley Board Fellows in here. Does that kind of touch your notion of teaching or giving back or inspiring others?
Yeah, absolutely. Look, I mean, problems get solved mean, it takes a village, right? And I think that whether it's the board fellows, whether it's I find that look, we're global citizens, right? And that comes with a responsibility and a right. We have a right to work on these problems. We also have a responsibility to work on these problems. We engage in whatever way we can engage, right? And so, and to me, these programs are a great way to, at the very least, get your feet wet.
Okay, so let me ask you this. Could you have gotten where you are now in terms of your work and your understanding of things without having gone through that circuitous route of the doctorate and the consulting and the filmmaking? I mean, does it take a kind of circular path through life to land on what's really most meaningful to you?
Are you asking if the shortest distance between 2 points is a
I'm
straight
not
line?
asking you shortcuts. No, I'm not. I'm really not.
Yeah.
Another way to ask that would be, what should people who are graduating with an MBA now think about doing? But that's too broad. So I'm trying to get at, is it just part of the process that you've got to put yourself out there, that you've got to try things, that you've got to kind of, one of the things I noticed in your story is you really paid attention to your unrest. You paid attention when things were bothering you in your work, that you weren't satisfied or you didn't feel comfortable. You paid attention to those things and you developed a point of view. And maybe the reality is you just have to go through a number of those experiences, and that's how you develop as a person and a professional. I don't know. I guess it's that the question is in there for me.
Well, I mean, Jennifer Doudna is going to have the impact she's going to have on the world is so different, right? And so much more, right? And so, look, each person's journey is their own, right? As long as we're asking ourselves the right questions, right? That's what matters to me. Is, to your point, are we listening to ourselves and making the appropriate changes? Sometimes we may not need to change, but the important thing is listening to ourselves.
Okay. Well, let me thank you so much, Shashi. I really think that we're all grateful. COVID has brought a lot of awful things. One good thing it's brought is you locally and hooked up on internet so we could talk to you today and hear from you. So we're grateful for that. But really, thank you for taking your time to share with us, to inspire us. And we'll take it away the best we can from what you shared. Thank you.
Thank you. It's a joy and a privilege to be part of this community. Thank you so much.
We're so glad you're here. Thank you. And thank you everyone for taking your time. I hope it's been thought-provoking. I hope it's helped you to challenge yourself. And what are you doing now? What do you want to do next? Because we all depend on one another, as Shashi said. Okay. Thank you all very much. One question, Shashi. I did have a question from somebody. Are you willing to share your slides? I don't know if that's appropriate or not, but I'll ask you.
I'll share some version of this. Yeah.
Okay. That would be great. That would be great. Yeah. And we'll put it on the Center for Social Sector Leadership website. So in a little while, you can get to that.
Yeah, that first and last slide I'll probably take out though.
It's Berkeley. Come on, put it on. Whatever you judge best. Okay. Thanks again, Shashi.
Right. Be well.